All right, so you have joined us for recruiting, supporting, and retaining diverse researchers. And this is going to include a use case from what is called the SC-CTSI, and we'll explain what that is, in terms of trying to take a responsive approach to more racial equitable recruiting, and that is using, in this case, a tool called PRISM, which William is going to tell you more about. So please, William, introduce yourself.
Absolutely. Thank you, Catherine. Good morning. My name is Dr. Wilman A. Christian III, and I am the Director of PRISM in the National Equity Network at the USC Race and Equity Center. Very glad that you all joined us and glad to talk with you all about some racial equity and PRISM.
And I am Catherine, and I am leading a brand new education resource center, which is located at an NIH-funded hub. So we are an institute for clinical and translational science for research. And basically what we're attempting to do is impact human health by more efficiently and effectively training what would become Dr. Fauci's. More Dr. Fauci's is a good way to think about it. So we've partnered with Wilman, and we are offering you this session today and welcome your critical feedback about our efforts, as well as hope to hear about your own plans in this space, in your own units. We do have objectives for our work today. So by the end of our time together today, we are going to be able to describe how PRISM can serve as a resource for recruiting. For right now, we're thinking of PRISM as an online tool. It's a platform similar to LinkedIn in that users can post their profiles, find job opportunities, and recruiters can find them. Wilman is going to give us a deep dive, a demo into PRISM. We'll also provide constructive feedback on how my own unit, called SC-CTSI, is using PRISM and other strategies to help improve the recruitment, support, and retention of a more diverse workforce of researchers. And finally, we'll hear from you. We'd like to hear how you might use some of my unit's ideas, and as well as William's tool, PRISM, and your own strategies to work in this space. It is participatory, so it's not a webinar, it's a workshop. You'll be working in groups and sharing these ideas with us. So we're going to go right into groups, actually. We're going to go into groups where you can meet each other and you can discuss and admit some of the barriers that you've identified, either personally or in your unit here at USC or wherever you work, to setting and accomplishing goals for recruiting, supporting, and retaining diverse candidates. You know, it would really surprise us if you say there aren't any barriers. So if you've encountered no barriers, we'd love to know what's contributed to that as well. Part of our work today together, Wilman and I have definitely an aspiration. We would like to be honest about admitting that there are perceived as well as actual barriers to working in this space. And so we're modeling here that we're going to admit ours, and we're hoping that you're going to share yours about too right now. Before we go into breakout groups, I'm going to stop this. I'm going to share the instructions for the breakout group through the chat, and also we'll take questions right now. Any questions about what you're about to do in the chat with each other?
Yep.
Okay, so here comes the instructions. You know, you're going to talk to each other about what you're going to see as your perceived barriers, or you may have actual barriers. So that's a question I'm getting in private chat about what you're about to do. Okay, so what have been the barriers? If no barriers, we're surprised. So tell us how that's happened. Here we go into breakout groups. Enjoy meeting your colleagues and speaking about barriers. Okay, here we are back together. And I would like to hear from at least one person who feels comfortable sharing one of the barriers you heard from colleagues or one of your own. And if you don't want to open your mic and speak, we would like you to contribute in the chat instead or in addition to. So let's take a pause here to debrief what you've heard about in your breakouts where you were discussing barriers.
Hi, I'm Joyce Ritchie. I'm happy to contribute to the discussion. So one of the topics that I discussed was that the barriers that I have seen have been those, in a sense, those societal barriers where we have been restrictive and really truly, recruiting diverse candidates and on whatever level. And what does that look like? Is that we haven't, tapped into those networks where I think that, hands down, I think that you have just an incredible applicant pool. So I think that that's truly, for me, that has been the barrier, because I've seen how this works, from the standpoint of being over at the medical school and working, with diverse applicants on all levels. And they exist, but it's just, just like PRISM, what it's offering, you have to be receptive to those ideas, and you have to have that in your plan in terms of your recruitment. So those are just my thoughts.
Yes, and your colleagues are speaking to that in the chat about being receptive. Some saying that even discussing diversity is a major hurdle in their departments. And interesting to note that I've also heard a similar barrier that you're discussing, where folks will say, well, there just aren't any candidates. That's not true. They're there. Shanisha wanted to go ahead with a comment. Please do.
Hi, and I guess I would say I'm a graduate student. So in terms of support, like even if you think about recruiting students into the university, or students who are graduate assistants or serving different roles, research roles within the university. For me, I think some of the things that stand out to me when we talk about recruitment, you can recruit people to apply, but are you hiring those people? If you are recruiting a diverse candidate pool. So that's one. But in addition to that, the way we conceptualize diversity, oftentimes we look at it in terms of race and ethnicity, but what about first generation status? What about socioeconomics? And so I think as we evolve or devolve societally or institutionally, I think about what does diversity look like. I know that I'm from a major African-American city, but I know, me being a Black person at this university, a lot of the people of color I've encountered have been situated mostly in white space. And so when we think about where you're reifying, perpetuating certain ideologies and value system, you can, even though you may have someone who looks different, diverse in appearance, their mindsets, their thinking, their experiences would be the same as someone who has been situated in a global context, or in a low income context, or or other metrics. So
that's a really good insight, Shanice. Thank you so much for that. One thing that you did acknowledge and you brought up in this workshop is that there are a multiplicity of ways to think about diversity, right? And sometimes centering in on one aspect can make us lose out on other aspects that could be beneficial for folks coming to our organization. So thank you for that.
Yes, and it's almost like you're a plant in our audience, because we're about to discuss definitions. My unit works under very specific definitions that come from the NIH. So we're going to go on to that. And I do see other hands, so please contribute to the chat. We're going to take frequent pauses to come back to the chat and your comments and themes. I am going to share what our definitions are, and then Wilman's going to share as well the definitions that relate to PRISM. So I'm screen sharing again here, because the NIH, again, my center, my institute, is an NIH funded hub. Therefore, because we're funded by a grant from the NIH has certain terms that they use and certain goals for these populations. So the term used that we're going to use today is URMs, which for the NIH, the National Institute of Health, stands for underrepresented minorities. And those are defined by the NIH. And I'm going to read you or share those definitions. So it's racial and ethnic groups that represent underrepresented people in biomedical research. The NIH says that those are Blacks or African Americans, Hispanics or Latinos, American Indians or Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians, and other Pacific Islanders. It also includes individuals with disabilities, individuals from disadvantaged backgrounds, low socioeconomic status, and women. So the definition of when my unit says we're trying to improve recruiting, support, and retention for URMs, that's what we mean following the NIH. However, you're also going to hear us use the terms BIPOC or people of color, and Wilman is going to go through those.
Thank you, Catherine. So in social sciences, our conceptualization of identity, we understand it as being ever evolving, right? So in the discourse, you may hear different terms. In one moment, you may hear one term being used, and in another moment, you may hear another term that arises that more fully speaks to people of color and ways in which we are understanding racial identity and identity. So with that, I want to introduce you to two terms, BIPOC and people of color. These are acronyms that we use in the social sciences and to think about people of color, right? So these terms are used to refer to non-white people groups. These acronyms are person first language. This enables one to shift from placing the emphasis on one's status as it relates to their identity. This is in contradistinction to the term, for example, URM, right? Well, where that term might refer to racially minoritized folks, the emphasis is placed on them being underrepresented. And though these terms may be correct in one sense, or that term may be correct in one sense, we want to also think a little bit more broadly about people of color and some of the inequities that they've historically encountered that speak to their present day status. So BIPOC refers to Black, Indigenous people of color, and people of color just refers to person or people of color. So why are these terms significant? They acknowledge the humanity of the person or the people group we're discussing first, instead of putting the emphasis on one status. Going back to our URM example, when considering racially minoritized folks in the sciences, the first word that you heard here was underrepresented, which speaks to their status or the consequences of inequities within systems that don't serve them well. So we want to move away from language and thinking and talking about groups as perpetually disadvantaged, what one might call a deficit thinking, to centering and better acknowledging their humanity in different contexts. The main difference between these two terms is that people of color, or POC, is a more general term referring to non-white people of color, where the newer term BIPOC, the idea is to draw attention to the varied ways that non-white people of color encounter discrimination, prejudice, inequities, and so on. For example, domestically, Black people and Indigenous people are the two primary racial or ethnic groups who have historically been oppressed at the founding of the US and continue to bear the brunt of those impacts. And just to kind of give you an idea of racial ethnic groups that fall under these umbrella terms, Black in the BIPOC definition refers to African American folks of Korean descent. Indigenous refers to American Indians, Native Americans, First Nations folks, Native Alaskans, or Alaskan Natives. People of color is a little bit more broad, referring to Indian, East Asian, and Southeast Asian folks, Latin American folks, Pacific Islander folks, and so on. Just a quick update on when to use these terms. One source suggests that when discussing issues pertaining to Black people, Indigenous people, and other people of color, and it isn't possible to get more specific, you may use BIPOC. So one might use this term to speak about broad issues or phenomena that affect non-white people of color broadly. But if you are speaking specifically to issues germane to specific racial or ethnic groups within this umbrella term definition, you would want to speak specifically and use that racial group identifier. So for example, if you were talking about, let's say, a health issue that affects Asian American folks, you wouldn't say this issue or health issue affects BIPOC folks. You would say that this health issue, for example, affects Asian American folks specifically. And I guess I'll go from that right into some of the barriers that we talk about and that we think about when recruiting underrepresented folks or people of color. So when we talk about barriers, we're actually talking about policies, practices, approaches, ways of thinking that perpetuate racial inequities and terms of recruiting people of color. Now, some of these barriers you brought up in your group, but I'll kind of share some of the barriers that our research center has come across in our 11 plus years of research. So when we talk about barriers, we have to discuss and acknowledge the ways that people within the aforementioned acronyms, the BIPOC and people of color or racial groups or ethnic groups, have been locked out of opportunities from working in higher ed or other industries, despite their talents and brilliance. We also have to acknowledge that an insignificant amount of attention and intentionality has been directed towards these groups. And because of this has resulted in an increase in them being recruiting or sought out for roles and being hired, right? So for instance, this, the lack of attention or lack of intentionality, it has resulted in inequities. So as a result of this, barriers remain and the onus falls primarily to people of color to get into these roles, and organizations don't do anything or aren't doing enough to change how they are approaching this issue. So these are reasons why barriers remain. Some of the barriers that our research center has encountered includes, but are not limited to, a lack of information or adequate data on people of color and their trajectories in specific industries, poor knowledge on equity issues on behalf of the organization. Oftentimes there are misguided assumptions about people of color and where they want to work or what they want to do or what industries they'd be fit to work in. There's an often held excuse that people of color are hard to find. And this is not true, because I know a lot of people of color that are ready, willing, and able to work in different industries and in different sectors and are ready to be employed. There's also, as you might consider, bias and prejudice in the talent acquisition process. There are studies related to that. And then campus climate issues. So for example, one person brought up the lack of support, right? So it's one thing to recruit folks, people of color to your campus, but it's another thing to not provide support to them. And this oftentimes results in turnover, or what we like to call climate-driven departure. So with that, I want to talk a little bit more about approaches to remediate barriers. And with that, we'll go to the next slide.
Okay, before we do, there was a quick question in the chat. Does the
Oh, sure.
NIH definition cover Southeast Asians? It does not. The NIH only lists the groups that I mentioned as considering them to be underrepresented in the field of biomedical research. Okay, to clarify that. All right, Willem, so let's talk about the response to barriers as racial responsivity.
All right, thank you so very much for that, Catherine. So in light of some of the barriers that I mentioned, what's needed is a racially responsive approach that takes the onus off people of color and places it on the institution to better recruit them into positions. This helps to counteract the barriers that I previously mentioned. So the first thing that's, when we talk about a racial responsive approach, is awareness, right? So this is an awareness, a deep awareness and understanding of past racial injustices of different groups. And remember that racial inequities and racial injustices have affected people groups differently and how they currently affect them, right? The second thing is stakeholders should identify and demonstrate their understanding of race and how it reproduces inequities, racial inequities, and racial inequalities. Thirdly, a racially responsive approach involves critical thinking. So we encourage folks in their racially responsive approaches to think critically about racial oppression, disenfranchisement, and how these things are embedded within systems. And finally, a racially responsive approach is one that emphasizes race and makes it central in one's response, solutions, and other types of actions. And in talking about racial responsivity, before we move on to a deeper dive into PRISM, I really want to emphasize the last point, or the fourth point, that racial responsivity is a way of thinking, doing, and acting that enables leaders to think creatively and strategically about how to respond and solve racial issues, right? So I remember earlier in the presentation, someone had mentioned either through the chat or through the presentation or raising their hand that even bringing this up, or the lack of a strategic plan, or talking about race in one's organization, it kind of engenders feelings of, I guess, anxiety for some folks on behalf of the organization, or there's reticence to engage that topic. Well, one way that we suggest organizations navigate that is through racial responsivity, actually leaning into that supposed discomfort, finding out how to be racially responsive in their approach through racial literacy and other types of racial learnings and other types of racial tools to remediate racial inequities, right? Because not engaging the question of race or racial inequities in the organization can lead to more racial inequities. So with that, our research organization, Research Center, the Race and Equity Center, we've been doing racial equity research for more than 10 years. And most of our work, not most, but all of our work and research is based on this idea of race consciousness or racial responsivity. The idea is to create tools and research that help colleges, universities, businesses, firms, and other types of organizations navigate racial issues. The racial issue that we're talking about today is the lack of recruiting of people of color in specific organizations, and create tools and approaches that help organizations close such gaps. And it's that type of thinking that we develop PRISM out of. Again, thinking about PRISM from the inside out, both using our knowledge of racial equity, what could be helpful to colleges and universities, and building PRISM in a way that centers people of color while helping colleges and universities more equitably recruit them.
And Wilman is about to take us through a brief demo of PRISM, but before he does, we're wondering if you could show us an emoji. Perhaps you could give us the thumbs up emoji if you had ever heard of PRISM before this workshop. I know in my unit, most folks had not. Has anyone heard of PRISM before this workshop? Give us a thumbs up emoji. Okay, a few. Huh? All right, so then for our use case in our unit, we're using PRISM as one of the strategies towards achieving this goal, and we'll show you the others we have been using as well. But first, let's take a demo of PRISM. While Wilman is showing you this demo, I'd like you to keep some notes about what aspects of PRISM might be uniquely applicable to your unit or your work as you're thinking about this goal as well. Okay, thanks, Wilman. Take it away.
All right, thank you so very much, Catherine. So yeah, just a kind of short introduction into what PRISM is. You heard Catherine and I talk about it earlier. It is a website or a platform that the Race and Equity Center created over 2 years ago to help colleges and universities identify and better recruit people of color to work in the higher education industry across a variety of different positions, including but not limited to research positions, faculty, instructional or teaching positions, and administrative or staff positions. Again, this response is a racially responsive approach built on years and years of research, talking to campus leaders and doing campus climate studies, where we would often talk to leaders about, why aren't there more people of color employed in positions of influence on your campus? And often we'd be met with a list of excuses or perceived barriers to that particular issue. And so our thinking with PRISM was to take those barriers away from colleges and universities, center people of color, and provide a solution to recruiting, hopefully ultimately hiring more people of color on one's college campus. Again, we built it from the inside out, primarily used to recruit and post jobs, aimed at colleges and universities. And I'll take us through a little bit more. Let's go to the next slide, please. So when we talk about PRISM, it's kind of like two sides of one coin, right? You have colleges and universities who subscribe to the platform on an annual basis. For USC employees and USC as an institution, because this is home base and we developed the tool here, it's completely free to use. But any organization or post-secondary institution that is not USC has to pay to use PRISM to search the database of professionals of color who want to work in higher education. So, this, if you look at the slide here, you'll see on the right-hand side of the screen that this is primarily what colleges and universities come to the platform to do. On the left-hand side of the screen are individual users or profile creators. These are higher education job seekers who come to the platform, who want to be recruited to work in the industry. They already are either working in the industry or coming from a different industry, and are looking to transfer their skills, expertises, experiences, and so on to the higher education industry. The way that we've created profiles is for the experience to be kind of front and center. If you compare us to one of our quote unquote rivals, you'll see that if you are looking to try and find folks to work in higher education, like let's say if you're looking on LinkedIn, it's a little bit convoluted, whereas when we designed our profiles and for folks to put their information in, we wanted it to be kind of clear, concise, so that recruiters could see their expertises, their skills, and so on in clear and meaningful ways. So they come to the platform, individual users, to put their profile information out there and hopefully be recruited. So here are institutional user roles. I won't get too much into the weeds of this, but typically when an institution is onboarded, there are 3 ways that the page or the platform is managed by an institution. And this involves different roles of access and also different ways that jobs can be posted. So you'll see that listed here. We'll go to the next slide. And so going back a little bit more to the user profiles, you'll see that, again, I talked about creating the profiles in ways that were very clear. The layout is attractive and easily identifiable and recognizable for recruiters. So I'm not going to go through the weeds of everything that's on a potential profile, but this is what you'll see here. One's picture is to the left, and then their expertise, experience, discipline, years of experience, so on and so forth. Now, what I will say is the interesting thing about user profiles is that the information that you see on the right side of the screen, including their job title, years of experience, publications, education, field of discipline in which they worked or have majored in, this information can be searched by recruiters. There are different filters that a recruiter can go into the platform and search by. So let's say they're looking for someone very specific or an individual with a specific set of experiences. Let's say majoring in English, has a PhD in English, has 3 years experience in the professoriate, is open to moving to the sunny state of Los Angeles, California. Recruiters can go into the profile, the platform, and select these different filters and search for folks who meet those criteria and invite them to apply. So again, going back to something I mentioned earlier, intentionality, and that's very big. And one of the reasons that we created PRISM. Let's move forward. So job posting, again, the idea here was to make job posts clear and attractive. With job posts and subscribing institution, they subscribe at a different dollar amount each year, and each dollar amount has different levels of jobs they can post annually. For USC, it is an unlimited amount of jobs we can post annually because this is home base. This is where we created this technology. Within the job post, you'll see different information that is relevant to the job post or those who may be seeking employment in higher education. I do want to draw your attention to the last 2 bullet points, the institutional culture statement and the university EEO statement. We want to differentiate ourselves from different job posting platforms in that for people of color, they may be looking for a specific criterion or specific things that signal that this institution is a great organization to work in, that it's doing what it needs to do in terms of that it has a good campus racial climate. So with that in mind are the reasons that we encourage institutions to provide those 2 bullet points of information, as it helps candidates make informed decisions about where they want to work and where they'll seek out employment. Let's advance. Networking. This is another reason that both subscribing institutions, colleges, and universities, and or individuals come to the platform for. For subscribing institutions, they come to the platform to search out employees, potential employees within our user database. Those who are profile creators or job seekers, they can connect with other job seekers in the network with whom either they share a common interest, they might be working in the same field, they may have attended the same conference, who knows? The idea is for them to network and trade either information, professional tips, even insights about different colleges and universities to, just increase the professional network of people of color. So let's advance as well. So that brings us to another breakout room. Catherine?
Yes, and a couple of questions we had in the chat before this that I can answer. There are 1,900 current users of PRISM, as well as 22 institutions and several USC schools like Rossier, Marshall, and Annenberg. So what we're interested to hear from you is, now that you've seen a demo of PRISM, what's your department already doing? Or if it's not yet doing something, what goal does it have for racially responsive recruiting? And now that you've heard from Wilman, how could PRISM, as an example of just one tool or one strategy you might use, specifically serve as a resource for you? I'm going to put these instructions through the chat so you have them to reference during your discussion in your breakout groups. Let me stop sharing and see if you have any questions before we do this task. Yes, Carmen, it is possible to schedule a similar presentation of PRISM. You can contact Wilman and arrange for that. That's something I'll let you know that we've been doing in my own unit. You can also look it up yourself and tour it, and there are resources there as well as training resources for your recruiting team and templates for language to put in job posts.
Thank you.
Okay, so through the chat, I'm sending the document that contains the instructions for our next breakout group, and I'm about to send us off into breakout rooms again for about 10 minutes here. Okay, welcome back, everyone. I wanted to mention two themes I heard when visiting you, and feel free to share more, either through chat or opening your mics. So one theme I heard was, if PRISM is free to USC, wouldn't it be great if our two systems, Workday and PRISM, on the back end could talk to each other, so that if we post a job to Workday, it could be posted to PRISM? One theme I heard. And another theme I heard is that, we're just touching on the first step, which is recruiting, but that's involved with supporting, creating a culture of support and retaining as well. And as we'll see in the case of my unit's example, involved with mentoring. So if I forgot anything, please add something else that came out of your thoughtful discussions.
Yeah, thank you for that, Catherine. One of the things that we discussed was PRISM is one tool, but to do this work, as you mentioned, there are a multiplicity of tools that should that should be employed. I really like what Cecilia brought up in this idea of a framework, because though the contexts are different and the organizations are different, a framework, a racially responsive framework, helps to formalize, this approaches and responses, so that folks can be on the same page, and so that things aren't done randomly. They're done in a formal way. They're done in a way that makes sense, in a logical way that helps to remediate racial inequities.
Okay, as we proceed, I'm going to begin sharing examples from my own unit, CTSI, and we're going to invite critique on what we've done so far. We understand it's far from enough, far from complete. And sometimes our goal is that it's easier to see in someone else's work or someone else's progress and to critique that than perhaps to see it in our own. So with that goal in mind, I'll present to you what we've been doing so far and with Wilman's assistance, and then we'll open it up to critique. So after I present that, our next activity will be for you to critique it, with the goal of providing feedback to us so that we can keep going and so that we can all keep going, and then we'll hear your own goals. Okay, so I'm going to share what we have been doing thus far, which means up to this very moment in time, or this workshop here together today. Okay, so our efforts to date, we knew that our problem, and also defined by the NIH, we are grant funded by the NIH, was in recruiting, supporting, and retaining diverse researchers, doing a better job at that. And we call those, again, URMs. So one of the first things that we have accomplished is we petitioned letters of commitment to hire from all department chairs. And what this meant is that we drafted a letter, and I can show you a sample in a moment, and we sent it to the Keck School of Medicine chairs to sign it. And 26 of them, all the chairs, signed that letter of intent. But as we all know, that's a good intention, and it would stop there if we didn't take any action. So we have to turn an intention into action. So we did bring in experts, such as recommended ones from the President's office, President Folt's office, to assist us with ideas and next steps. We also made a significant change in the Department of Psychiatry. So they lobbied to add a certain type of therapy degree, which is traditionally held or more popularly held by people of color, to the accepted credentials list. So essentially they expanded the type of therapy credential that is accepted, and that led to significant gains in that department. So what we could see is in 2020 that they were able to hire in psychiatry 50 new faculty, 30% of which were URMs, 55% were people of color, 66% were women. And that was far beyond any other of the programs comparable in its school. And part of that now is partnering with the USC Race and Equity Center, in particular Wilman, to use PRISM, so that moving forward, we can post jobs on that platform, which means that people need to know about it. So one of the first things we need to do is repeatedly ask Wilman to explain and re-explain, or to train our partners, particularly our local HR partners who weren't aware of PRISM and who may have excellent ideas, such as brought up in this session, to make PRISM and Workday talk to each other, or to use different language for their job posts, or to be posting to PRISM in the meantime before the systems can talk to each other. This also meant for us internally that we needed to plan on revising our mentoring programs. Our mentoring programs often match mentors and mentees that may not look like each other. And we know from research that if your mentor or your teacher or your instructor looks like you, it has better results. It's more effective in many places. So we can either train our existing mentors, or we can recruit mentors that look like our mentees, or both. So there is curriculum that can give training to our mentors in this role. As you mentioned in one of your breakout groups, you mentioned faculty development. This would be considered faculty development or training. And finally, so far, we are inviting all of our applicable students in our programs, which would include scholars, and they would also include high school students. We have community outreach programs, and alumni, to open PRISM accounts. So to make it a part of the class or a part of the program where there's a dedicated session where they're informed about PRISM and they can open their profiles right then and there, along with skills that we're already teaching them in some of these programs, such as resume building workshops. We've also changed our language. So frequently these programs were termed pipeline in the past, which is offensive. And so we have changed or updated that language to call them pathways instead. It was particularly offensive to Native Americans, as well as to people who felt like they were a commodity in a pipeline supplying us with something rather than benefiting with something. So these are our efforts, and I'm going to send you these efforts through the chat so that you'll have them there and you'll be able to perform your critique. So what we did learn, though, from this is that commitment is quick, intention is quick, and intention is there. So it's pretty easy in our case to get people on board with the idea. it's much slower to have change or to take action because it's repetitive, repetitive, repetitive. It takes explaining it from the beginning to each and every person from zero every time. And that can be very slow. But commitments can turn into action. It can be done if we go with our mantra, which is to keep pushing past perceived and actual barriers. So for example, one commitment was this letter. Here's an expert of the letter that was signed by all the chairs in the Keck School of Medicine, stating their commitment, and it turned into actual action, for example, with the Department of Psychiatry significantly increasing its hires, its URM hires. So when we learn from our lessons, we can learn from Willman's article, and we'll share that article at the end of our workshop. He recommends using a SMART goal approach. In my opinion, it has been very helpful to know our audience. So in my case, my audience are colleagues that are used to public scrutiny of their published results. The people I work for and with are very aware that they are needing to hit goals and to document research and evidence. This is what they're like in their souls. So it was very effective for them to know that it's going to be their results on this effort are going to be stated in the grant. They're going to be stated today in this workshop with you publicly. And this was helpful with how they work. So finding out how the folks worked was helpful. And so helpful for us was taking from Willman's advice in his article to use a SMART goal approach, knowing that we have to report evidence like this anyway, with the sphere we work in, with our field we work in. So if we can make our goals explicit, it was more helpful. If we can include measurable percentages or goals by which we hope to improve this, it was more helpful. If we could indicate action beyond intention or commitment, it was more helpful. If we could articulate why is it important to have more, especially in STEM, it was more helpful. And finally, how much time? So is there a time limit on our goal? For us, there is, because there's a grant-funded time limit, or there's an academic time limit, or there's a hiring committee time limit. Those were all quite helpful. And that's what we've learned here. So now we want your critical feedback. So we'd like you to discuss in your groups a strength and weakness of what we've been doing so far. And we have suggested guidelines for critiquing us if you'd like them. If you could start and end your critique of us with a positive statement, it might help us, the hamburger or sandwich approach. If you might use I statements, so if I don't understand something rather than it doesn't make sense. The more specific your suggestion for us could be, the more likely we are to understand it and be able to improve on it. And if you have ideas that could be neutral questions, we would be happy to answer questions that you might have of us, such as what guided your decision. Okay, so before we go into breakout groups for the last time here, I'm going to stop sharing and see if there are any questions. And I'm also going to put these instructions in the chat. Any questions before we go back to critique my unit's updates? Okay, again, sometimes it's easier to see in others than to critique our own unit or ourselves. So we do appreciate that feedback that you're about to share with us. With that, I'm going to recreate our breakout groups now. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Visited the groups, and I'll provide a summary here of what I heard, and then please interrupt with your additional comments and specificity. So one critique we heard is that, we should really tell these departments that have signed this letter their progress. So we should get back to them and tell them how they're doing. And it was mentioned that that is an ideal goal, and that it is difficult because it's hard to get from the university data that's disaggregated by race. And so that's something that needs to be improved upon. Another one was the idea of setting measurable goals so that those goals could be reported. Another one was educating those in power, decision makers, hiring committee. So not only is the hiring committee or are the decision makers diverse themselves, but also there's been training there. And the idea of expectations, which is also sometimes referred to as the black tax, whereas we have people of color in positions that are constantly asked or constantly taxed with the additional work of being a spokesperson, for example, or a trainer. in the space. And so to be careful that we are avoiding that in our work. Okay, what else did I miss here from your breakout groups critiquing CTSI efforts to date? Open your mics or put it in the chat.
I just had a quick question. I mean, was it difficult to get everyone that you needed to sign on to that commitment letter? I mean,
No, getting the commitment was easy, especially when we write the letter and all they have to do is sign it or provide the digital signature. But getting action beyond a commitment is hard. It's slower. And somebody mentioned the intentionality that it might be slow on purpose, which I thought was interesting, which goes to our next slide, that we want to remember our mindset here today, that we're pushing past perceived and actual barriers. Some of the barriers truly are there, and some of them are perceptions that we need to continually push past. Find ways around, keep asking, keep starting from zero and just keep going, re-explaining it, keep asking for the data till we get it, pushing past the level of commitment into action. So this is our aspiration. You knew this was Wilman's and my aspiration from the start of our time together today. We face this in our efforts, and we're sure you face them as well in yours.
And
So
Catherine,
since,
I added,
yeah,
sorry.
please, no, please go.
I added that point, and I added that point because I was thinking about back to during the height of the pandemic when there was legislation, I think, brought in by Trump about banning or students who are coming into the country, international students. There was some type of measure that was put in place that was blocking students to getting back into the country. And I remember that getting an email. This is right at the height of the racial reckoning in our society over the summer break. And I remember seeing there was a letter that came out where every dean from every department school within USC signed it. And there was also action behind that shifted the legislation that was put in place. It wasn't just at USC, but it was at institutions across the country. And it shifted, and they got that thrown out almost within 3 days. And so that's what I mean, where sometimes slow, like we say, oh, it takes time. I remember following the Black at USC page and all these things like, oh, we have to work to this and we need to do some more research. But it's like, oh, when you think about USC, the East Asian population within USC making up close to 50% of the population, that's where the money, where students who are paying full price of tuition comes in. You can get these changes when you want to, as opposed to that's what I meant there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I still want to, and I'm going to keep wanting to. And so that's what we're going to do. So we would like to know what you're going to do. So our last update, the last time you'll be together, you might choose to make it reflective. So when you go into breakout groups this time, you might not speak with each other. You might be journaling or writing down your own thoughts. It's really up to you. Or you might speak because you like to feel that interaction of maybe getting an idea from colleagues that you could incorporate in your own work. But we'd like to know your plan. So we've shared ours and you've given us critique, but we'd love to know, how might you take a more racially responsive approach to diverse recruiting? Or if you're past recruiting, you're ready for supporting and further supporting and retaining. So we'd like you to create at least one action item. If you don't think your unit can commit to an action item yet, then what can you yourself commit to? So one that I'm working on having my unit commit to is, can we attend the USC's Race, Equity, and Wellbeing Spring Series of workshops? Can we commit to training as one step, as one next step? So we'd love to hear what you can commit to, and we're going to stop sharing. I'll take any questions before we go into this last breakout group. It's going to serve your own purposes, which could be just reflective. So you may choose not to speak with your colleagues. You may choose to turn off your camera and mic and have a reflective moment. It's up to you. Any questions about this last activity where we're going to make a commitment ourselves and then hopefully follow through with a commitment? Here come the instructions in the chat. Okay, and we'll go into breakout groups, and after that we'll be wrapping up our session. Okay, welcome back everybody. Coming back from breakout rooms. Yes, welcome back. A couple of things I heard as you were setting plans. One of them I heard was using my voice now that I feel like I'm in more of a position of power at the university. I heard expanding our applicant pool geographically. I also heard using this workshop, using information and resources from this workshop to present to my own team. What did I miss? What are some other ideas that you had for your own plans of how you might make a more racially responsive approach to diverse recruiting? Please share, voice or chat.
Helen and I was just talking, we were just talking with Helen about, she was talking about what scientists like thinking that they're objective. And oftentimes that's not always the case because there's always some credibility threats. And so I was thinking about in the recruitment process using that. Let's talk about what are some civility or credibility threats to us in this recruitment. What biases am I bringing that may present? And so that can help people who are part of the recruitment committee to being able to call it out and noticing it when it's surfacing.
So then also then going beyond noticing, so actually calling it out once you've had that training.
One thing I've been vulnerable with is being vulnerable and saying like, I'm noticing I'm being biased in this way because it makes people be vulnerable and to feel comfortable and, to tell the truth. And also talk about brave and safe space. But I was just in an event that was talking about the need for supportive and challenging. We don't, something should be uncomfortable because if it's safe, you're going to reify what already is.
Absolutely. And I love what you brought up, Shanice, because, it's moving organizations from one level of racial responsivity and literacy to deeper understandings, right? So for instance, we may start with some quantitative aspects, and then we may move to the qualitative aspects of how we're interpreting different data, right? How we're interpreting whether somebody who is applying for this position, why someone thinks they're qualified, why someone doesn't think they're qualified, which may or may not be racially influenced or biased, right? So I really like what you brought up because it talks about racial equity and racial responsivity as being an ongoing process and creating an environment in a space where, folks can make and admit mistakes, but also demonstrate that they're trying to improve upon their learning in this regard.
And we thank you so much for sharing. So to wrap up our session today, we're still here. And so you can call upon us and you can email us. And we wanted to let you know that we believe we have accomplished our objectives today. We've described how PRISM can serve as a resource. It's one of many tools. You have helped us by providing constructive feedback on our efforts so far. And we have used ideas from our efforts and from PRISM to plan how our own units or how we personally could adopt these and other strategies. In a moment, I'm going to put a link to a feedback survey in the chat. We would love your feedback. Especially, we'd like to follow up with you for those that would request resources. This is a way for us to contact you and to keep going with this work if you're interested in other workshops. So I'll put that link in the chat in a moment. And also let you know that if you do fill out that survey, we'll be able to send you these other links. So the literature that Wilman has written, the contacts for Race and Equity Center, and our own contacts at the Education Resource Center here at CTSI, the Clinical and Translational Science Institute. So I will put that in the chat right now as I'm thanking you and as we're pausing for our last questions. So let me get that link for you so you can complete the survey. And we'll take any last questions or comments before we end our time together.
I think this is amazing. The approach you all took to this workshop. You have a lot of facilitators that just want to hear themselves talk and they don't want to hear from the people. And so this was an opportunity where you all got to hear, and in addition to informing us, you all also are informing your practice as well. So I think this was a very smart approach that you all took.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
I would agree with that. And I came in not wanting to talk or like share out in any way, just wanted to listen. And I ended up sharing and learning a lot more than I thought. So thank you.
There you go. That means a lot to us. Thank you.
Yes, especially now that we're celebrating, 1 year on Zoom for many of us. We know that we're zoomed out and you had many sessions to select from where you could have just listened.
For me, I feel like it makes me think of what I can contribute in terms of me as an HR partner, and communicate to the stakeholders, and that we do together have a voice together, and what we can contribute, how we can advertise to, in terms of like widen your audience, because I think with more people contributing from the department, you guys will have more of a voice. Yeah.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Okay, so with that, I'll just end our time together. You do have the link to this survey there in the chat. So we would love for you to complete that. It is part of our data collection and a way for us to stay in touch. So thank you so much for joining us. And we
Thank
know
you
it
all.
won't be the last conversation we have together. We're here and hope to hear from you.